Hello and welcome to amarman.com YouTube channel. And in this video, we will discuss about a very important concept of object-oriented ABAP, that is instance constructor. So let's get started. What is an instance constructor in object-oriented ABAP programming? Basically, it's a special method with the name constructor, and it is called by the runtime implicitly. That is, it is called automatically by the runtime, and we don't call it explicitly. So a constructor is a method with the name constructor itself, right? What is the primary function of this constructor? It is to initialize the attributes when creating objects. So this is one of the most primary function of a constructor. Now, how do you create a constructor? The constructor, as we know, is a special method, and we can create the constructor by declaring a method in the class definition with the name constructor itself. So it's pretty simple. You declare a method with the name constructor in the class definition and you get an instance constructor. Now, constructor can have importing parameters and they can have exceptions. Few points related to constructor, that is, a constructor can access other components of the class. Constructor should always be defined under the public section, and then if an exception is raised inside the constructor, then the instantiation of the object will fail and no memory space is allocated. So these are some basics or important points related to constructor. So let us try to understand the concept of constructor with the help of an example. So let's switch to our SAP. So here I'm going to create a new program with the name, let's say, constructor. So this is a constructor example. All right, executable program, save. Let's place it in a local object. And let's start with the coding part. So very first thing is what we will do is we will define a class. So I say here class LCL definition, and class will end with end class. Then inside this, we will create a public section, as we have to create a constructor. And remember that constructors are always under the public section, always created under the public section. Let us define the constructor under the public section. So we will create a method. Constructor is basically a special method with the name constructor itself. So we will name it as constructor. All right. And this constructor can have importing parameters and exceptions only. So it cannot have changing, returning, exporting parameters. So let's have a importing parameter of type integer, and then I will also create one exception. Let's name it as exception1. Okay, so this is my constructor. This is the definition of the constructor. Now we will also have some attributes. We will create some attributes. So let's say we create an attribute, method variable 1 type integer. So this is a instance attribute, and I will create a static attribute. Let's say global variable 1 type integer. So these are the two attributes that I have created. So this is my definition part. Let us save the example, check it, and it asks that you have to implement the class, right? Because we have a constructor there. So let's do the implementation part. So we say here class LCL implementation, and then we end with a end class. Okay, and inside this we will create or implement our method, that is the constructor method. So the process of implementing the constructor is the same. There is no difference. Just like you implement other methods, in the same way we will implement the constructor method also. So here, first thing is that I would like to give a write statement here that the constructor means we are inside the constructor method. So let's say we say here constructor called, okay, and we will also initialize the attribute, that is mv1. So we'll say like mv1 is equal to iv input variable 1, and we will display the value of mv1. So we say here mv1 is equal to, and then we mention here mv1. Okay. Next thing that I would like to do over here is that we will initialize, or we will increment the value of the static attribute gv1 with 1. So we say here global variable 1 plus 1. And the objective is that, let's say we don't want to create more than 2 objects. So we want to restrict creation of more than 2 objects. So we can say here like if global variable 1 is greater than 2, and we place here and if, then we raise the exception exp1. Okay, so this is the overall implementation of our class, and we are raising the exception if we try to create more than 2 objects, then it should raise the exception. Okay, now the next step is we would like to create the objects. So let us create some objects here, type ref2 lcl, and we will create 3 objects to test our scenario. So we mention it as local object 2 and this as local object 3. So we have data reference of 3 objects. Next, let us create these objects. So we use create object, and then you can hit a control space and it will show you that, okay, these are the objects you have defined, these are the type reference you have. Select the object and hit shift enter, and you will get the proper signature of the constructor, or basically the creation of the object. Right, now you notice here when we are trying to create the object, this signature that we get here, this is because we have defined this constructor. All right, now for this one iv1, let us pass the value 10, and let's uncomment the exceptions. All right, and over here we can give a write statement like we say here exception raised local object 1. All right, so this is good enough. And similarly, we would like to create local object 2 and local object 3 for these 2 type references. So I will copy this and paste it 2 times, and then we change the name to local object 2 and this one to local object 3, and then let us change the input parameters also. So I mentioned over here 11, 10, 11, and this one we mention here as 12. All right, and in the write statement, let us mention exception raised local object 2, and over here let us mention local object 3. So the key point here that we understand is that whenever we are creating a constructor, we are having a constructor, then when creating the object, we have to pass the parameters as defined in the constructor. Okay, so we save this, check, and activate. All right, this is activated, and we will execute. So what we will get here is that, looking at the implementation part, so when we will call or create the first object, then the global variable 1 will have the value 1, and 1 is not greater than 2, so it will allocate or initialize the attribute and write this statement. Then we will create the local object 2, and 2 is not greater than 2. So again, it will create the object. And when we will try to create local object 3, then in that case, it will be 2 plus 1, 3, and 3 is greater than 2. So it will raise the exception. And in that case, it will not create the object, right? So if an exception is raised in the constructor, the instantiation of the object fails and no memory space is allocated. So let us see the output. And this is what we have here: constructor called, and the attribute, instance attribute value was initialized to 10. In this particular case also, constructor was called and attribute was initialized to 11. And over here we have got an exception because we are restricting the number of objects to just 2 objects. So this is a pretty good example of working with instance constructor, understanding the concept of instance constructor. I hope you must have liked this video, and if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, then please subscribe and hit the bell icon.